The Crisis of Islamic Civilization by Ali A. Alawi. Chapter 5 The Reformations of Islam. Reformers and Their Discontents. A good portion of these religious disputes was to do with the acceptable limits up to and conditions in which change can be tolerated within Islam without destroying its essential features. The issue of what is incontrovertibly fixed in the religion of Islam and what is capable of change has existed throughout the whole history of Islam. Heresies and even new religions such as the Baha'i faith grew when what was thought to be fixed was challenged and overthrown. The need to limit the scope of change before it turned destructive to the core doctrines of Islam became of paramount importance. The evolution of the four main schools of jurisprudence as a type of orthodoxy in Sunni Islam happened in response to the ever present risk of schisms and divisions affecting the Islamic community. Shiaism itself, doctrinally different in important ways from Sunni Islam, has also evolved its own form of orthodoxy, albeit after a considerable length of time. In both cases, the impulse was to control what was permissible, to establish authoritative structures for the belief systems and practices of the faith, and to ward off the possibility of deviations and unacceptable innovations. There are in reality only three aspects to question of immutability in Islam. The first deals with the relationship between God and the individual. The second with the relationship between humans themselves, and the third with the relationship between the human being and his or her own self. All these aspects must come together as a whole to establish what is unalterable. If the common denominators between the three are established, then these must, almost by definition, be considered the axioms of Islam. Thus, an inner spirituality which does not express itself in creedal doctrines or in an institutional or legal framework is intrinsically deficient. Similarly, the insistence on a particular aspect of Sharia law which is not matched both by the inner ethic and by the divine sanction becomes untenable in terms of its immutability. Within the framework of classical Islamic categories, these relationships are expressed as Sharia, the relationship between humans, Tariqa, the relationship between the individual and the self, and Haqiqa, the relationship between God and the human being. A major expounder on the problem of what is fixed and what is changeable in Islam, indeed in religion as a whole, is the contemporary Iranian philosopher Abdel Karim Soroush. Born in 1945 and educated in Iran and at London University, Soroush was one of the stalwarts of the Iranian Revolution of 1979. For a while, as a member of the Cultural Revolutionary Committee, he was responsible for revamping the Iranian higher education system, the vetting of academics, and the reconstitution of the curriculum. Later, he fell out with the new clerical establishment and became a well-known dissident Islamic thinker, part of the uniquely Iranian class of religious intellectuals. Soroush has been under constant harassments and threats of attack by agents of the Iranian establishment, but he has stood his intellectual ground inside Iran as well as in numerous appearances at various international conferences and academic institutions. Although his interests are wide-ranging and include the relationship of Islam with democracy, human and civil rights, gender issue, and political pluralism. He is best known for his theory of the expansion and contraction of religious knowledge. Enthusiastic Western commentators have called him the Islamic Luther, seeing in his work the possibility of Islam's supposedly long-delayed reformation. Soroush's principal contention is that there is a distinction between religion per se and religious knowledge. Religion, he asserts, is divine, having been revealed by God, but human beings are left to realize the purposes and precepts of religion. They do so through religious knowledge, which is entirely human and subject to all the dictates of human knowledge. Soroush reformulates the old adage of the metaphysical Sufis that While the haqiqa, that is reality or God, is absolute, the Sharia is relative. But Sarosh does so within the terms of his own philosophy of religion. Thus, Sharia becomes not a creed ordained by God, immutable and fixed, but rather one which allows for change and refinement within man's own interpretations of religious knowledge. Religious beliefs, no matter how intensely held, represent no more than one's own understanding of religion. Religious knowledge reforms part of any number of humanistic sciences and philosophies and is no different in essence from, say, sociology or metaphysics. It has a collective and dynamic identity and that remains viable through the constant exchange, cooperation, and competition of scholars. It may be full of errors or full of insights, but it will still be a human formulation, subject to contradiction and expansion within the temporal framework. So, divine effulgence created a sacred place in which the explorations of religious knowledge can take place. It is not a secular construct, since the purpose of those who seek religious knowledge is to find the divine principle behind mankind's condition and endeavors. For the believers, religion quickens the blaze of the sublime quest, delivers from inner attachments, grants ascent above earthly concerns, and induces a sense of utter wonder so that one may hear the call of God is the truth from every particle of the universe. Religious knowledge, on the other hand, is a sincere attempt to understand the prophetic message through repeated consultations with the sacred text and the tradition. Scholars of religion have no other status or service than this. They cannot appropriate for themselves the infallible or unerring status of prophets or imams. Sarosh's own theory has to be put in the context of the Iranian Revolution, of his disenchantment with the domination by the ulama and with the establishment of the quasi-infallible status of the walayat al-faqih, rule of the jurisprudent, and of his constant brush with the authorities on matters of doctrine, democracy, and human rights and freedoms. The theory undermines the intellectual and religious foundations of Islamic Republic by denying the legitimacy that the mujtahids give themselves as the final arbiters of religious law and doctrine. If religious knowledge is changeable and dependent on knowledge from outside the religious context, then it certainly follows that the ulama cannot make such astounding claims. The entire body of the Sharia is then recast in this context, and the received body of doctrines and practices relating to Islam are regularly questioned. Modern notions of freedom, rights, and democracy are reconciled with religious knowledge rather than tested against some invariant standard of reference drawn from the traditional theology or jurisprudence. Sarosh's ideal is not a secular, not even a democratic one, society, but a religious community where the sense of the sacred hovers over humanity. Knowledge of the sacred, however, is derived from the collective human experience in all the sciences and disciplines. Sarosh's reconstruction of Islamic knowledge opened the way for including all manner of constructs into the body of religious knowledge as defined by him, from the culture of rights to the issues of secularism, freedom, and democracy. Sarosh does not quite acknowledge that Western liberal values automatically become a part of the religious knowledge of our time, but he comes close to it. He is always careful to couch his analysis in general terms and categories without specifically adopting the notion. Liberal values are a necessary concomitant of contemporary religious knowledge. For example, he attempts to strike a balance in his treatment of the modern notion of human rights versus traditional emphasis on human duties to God. Human rights are a central element of modern political conditions and must therefore be taken into account when developing a religiously sanctioned system of government. A similar indirect case is made for democracy within a religious society. Sarosh sees a religious society as being essentially moral and therefore acting as the moral conscience of a democratic order. Democracy functions best when its leaders are subjected or subject themselves to moral rather than legal sanction. There is a natural affinity between a democratic sensibility and a religious morality. The Sorosian worldviews targets the Sharia foundation, that is, the relationship between human beings of Islamic civilization. By denying immutability and by inference, the validity of the systems which limit independent reasoning in religious decisions either to a privileged class of ulama or to a very narrowly circumscribed ambit of acceptable topics, the Sharia loses its innate conservatism. In fact, the Sharia may well not be necessary for an Islamic society, at least in its traditional form. Secular law and the notions of liberal democracy can be valid substitute as long as society as a whole retains its commitment to religious faith and uses a morality derived from religion in order to supervise and monitor those who exercise power. One assumes that Soros's religious society would automatically confirm the relationship between God and the human individual through belief in the sacred and in the absolute transcendence. In his later writings, Soros has given more attention to the relationship between the human being and the self. With his increased interest in the mystics of Islam and especially in the Sufi poets of Islam's middle centuries, who wrote in the medium of Persia, the poet Jalaluddin Rumi looms large in his concerns with the majestic sweep of his great poem, the Masnavi, and its intoxicating love of God. Once again, Sufism is brought as a form of traditional cover for a system which could be misinterpreted as it veers dangerously away from Islamic mainstream. But Soros stays defiantly within the bounds of Islam and could in no way be considered a secular modernist of any kind. His ultimate purpose is to revive Islam by broadening its concern with the ideas and structures which are outside of its inherited legacy and by engaging with modern values and systems. If the traditional forms in which the Sharia and its guardians are cast have to be sacrificed, then so be it. It may be a religious duty to dare to consider new forms in which God's purpose is to be manifested. However, Soros's theory is held together by the finest threads, namely the assumption that God's purpose cannot be ascertained at all times absolutely in the same way, as the domain of the sacred is forever barred from humans with very few exceptions, the prophets and those granted mystical insights. Nevertheless, the entire edifice of Islam is built on the indisputable existence of a sacred text and of the historical being who was Prophet Muhammad, and through whom the text was revealed. The text itself cannot be relativistic, although it may assume the relativity of aspects of it which deal with worldly matters. Rules for approaching the understanding of the sacred text have to be established. Otherwise, the text will sit in a vacuum, an undiscovered gem. Soros suggests that the standards used for reading Quran should be based on the body of human knowledge outside the domain of the strictly religious. In this manner, the rules of interpretation of the Quranic text will be shifting and necessarily inexact, but no body of knowledge can possibly exist without rules and axioms. So an entire building block of Islamic thought, was the transmitted part, becomes essentially tentative and imprecise. It is difficult to see how Soros's concept of religious knowledge would have any future in Islam. It will simply be overwhelmed by the profane world. Soros's ideal society is more akin to the mildly moral consciousness which exists in social democracies, but his is expressed in religious and sacred rather than in humanist idioms. Perhaps this would be an improvement on life in a theocracy, but it is hardly the desired destination for the consciously Islamic civilization. Testing the limits of the permissible. Soros questioned the static nature of the Sharia itself, but he did not refashion the meaning of ijtihad, independent reasoning. He placed the entire Sharia within the orbit of his definition of religious knowledge, that is, a man made construct which should be periodically re examined in the light of the state of knowledge and experience in other fields of human endeavor. He did not stray into more serious problem of questioning the immutability of the Quran. He maintained throughout the incomparability of the text and its divine provenance. Neither did he question prophecy and the person of the Prophet Muhammad in the spiritual universe of the believing Muslim, but others who have less cautious did so. One of these was the Sudanese reformist thinker and political activist Mahmoud Muhammad Taha, who paid for his transgressions with his life. Taha was born around 1910 in Sudan. He gravitated towards politics, founding with others the Republican Party, which was devoted to combating colonialism and the deep sectarianism within the Sudanese society. He was imprisoned in the late 1940s, and while in jail, he became a firm adept of Sufism, immersing himself in prayer, fasting, and adopting various ascetic practices. Jail was for him, as for so many others, a form of khalwa, the obligatory retreat for those who set themselves on the Sufi path. He seems to have been deeply influenced by the concepts of perfect human and of the unity of being, which are associated with the great medieval Sufi master Ibn al-Arabi and his successors. In the mid-1980s, Taha fell foul of the military regime of Nimeri, which has started out as a revolutionary clique inflected with communist thought. After a series of abortive coups and challenges, Nimeri proclaimed his regime's allegiance to political Islam and introduced Sharia law in Sudan. Taha's many opponents inside the regime and among the Islamist movement pushed for his arrest and trial for apostasy. He had already been found guilty of apostasy by the ulama of Sudan, who obtained two legal opinions on him from the Al-Azhar University in Cairo and from the World Islamic League in Mecca. Taha was hanged on 18th January 1985 on the accusation of apostasy. Taha was an extreme individualist. He is one of the few thinkers in modern Islam who build their system on the individual, what he called fardiya. The purpose of human existence for him is to achieve absolute individual freedom within a society which exhibits total social justice. The individual man and woman is the ultimate end, and everything else is the means to this individual, including the whole of creation and the Quran, he wrote. Taha's system can be best described as the application of the metaphysical Sufi doctrine of the unity of being to the conditions and circumstances of modern Muslim societies, inasmuch as the purpose of revelation is to enable the individual to seek salvation by recognizing the signs of God in one's self and in the outer world. The individual's quest reaches its culmination as the veils between God and human beings are removed. Taha recasts the devotional underpinnings of Islam, especially prayer, in terms of their historical setting and of the evolution of the individual's own spiritual reality and psychology. The more evolved a person is, the less he or she needs to be bound to the strict forms of the received acts of worship. There is the formal Islamic prayer, and there is the prayer of the individual who sees in each act of this sort a direct dialogue with God. There are the formal mechanisms for interpreting the Quran, and then there is the quest for the deeper, more subtle meanings which remove the barriers between the worshipped and the worshipper. Everything dissolves into the recognition that there is nothing in creation but God. Even prophecy becomes linked to the state of individual's own elevated spirituality. To rely on the Prophet's saying and conduct for one's own actions and beliefs is a sign of spiritual immaturity, which needs to be transcended as one moves along the spiritual path. This radical view goes well beyond the attempt to recast the Sharia in light of modern conditions. Basically, Taha is saying that modern conditions afford the spiritual person a far greater range of options than past conditions. The spiritualized individual in Islam understands and appreciates prophecy, but he or she must situate it in an age where the possibilities of direct spiritual experience were far fewer than they are today. Prophecy becomes a non essential item in religious awareness, at least for those who have progressed along the path of realizing God's purpose, of sensing that in the end God is all. Taha was equally radical in his treatment of the Quran. He uses the division of the chapters of the Quran into the Makkan and Madinan phases as a clear distinction between those chapters that can inspire the individual's quest for enlightenment, the Makkan verses, and those which deal with the more worldly matters of human relationships and social organization, the Medinan verses. The latter are clearly historical in nature and content and have no relevance to modern conditions. Nevertheless, they are part of the totality of the Quran, which has both a temporal and non-temporal aspect to it. The Makkan verses, on the other hand, are not situated in time. They are universally valid for the spiritual seeker, and they are a powerful aid to the full realization of man's spiritual potential. In the end, even the Quran will vanish in the direct encounter between human being and God. Nothing, as the Quran says, will be left except the visage of God. This goes beyond the bounds of ecstatic Sufism, which sought to find the inner esoteric dimensions within the outer forms of Islamic worship and conduct. Taha ends by denying the validity of the Madinan verses for modern conditions. Essentially, he rejects the Sharia as merely a historical legacy whose utility has been superseded. The legacy of Islam becomes nearly entirely ephemeral, with the exception of the supercharged spirituality of the Makkan verses. Taha abandons the Sharia leg entirely, leaving the plumbing of the individual's spiritual psychology and the Makkan verses of the Quran as the way to a revitalized Islamic civilization. This becomes his account of the second coming of Islam. The philosophical elegance of Saroshi's theory of religious knowledge and the spiritualized individualism, even iconoclasm of Taha, are expressions of a profound unease, even fear, concerning the ability of Islamic societies to join the concert of materially and culturally more advanced societies. They open avenues for explorations and discussions, but they do not serve as platforms for further evolution or development. The orthodox establishment closes ranks and the innovators are marginalized, then practically ignored. Taha was executed and Sarosh is hounded by the thugs of the reactionary clerics. There is, however, a common concern which seems to unite nearly all the would-be reformers of Islam, namely the issue of the Sharia, the outer rules and strictures of Islam. Nearly all seek to reform, modify, or eliminate the Sharia or form another part of the spectrum entirely to insist on its validity in its undiluted form. This focus on the Sharia distorts the essential unity of Islam, creating an unbalanced structure and proposals for change which are incomplete. Too much focus on the Sharia leaves spirituality in the shadows. Too little Sharia focus creates an unrecognizable and deficient Islam. As the moderate Sufi used to say, he who seeks spiritual awareness without constraining himself by the outer law is liable to heresy. He who seeks to only the outer law without spiritual attainment opens the way for corruption. Towering above these concerns is the religious genius of Muhammad ibn Idris al-Shafi, an 8th century jurist who framed the essential characteristics of Sunni Islam and whose influence, if only by example, extended to the Shia world. The formulation that Islam is the book and the way of Muhammad, Kitab wa Sunnah, is so rooted in Islamic consciousness that it would be impossible to consider Islam outside of this context. The edifice of the Sharia was built on the practice of Muhammad the Prophet, known through an authentic system of traditions attributable to the Prophet himself. The canons of prophetic traditions, such as those of Muslims or of Muhammad al-Bukhari, become foundational texts for Sunni Islam. Shafi'i allowed some leeway to the individual jurists, mainly through reasoning and the consensus of scholars, but their scope was severely circumscribed. The corpus of Prophet's sayings and actions become the essential yardstick by which God's purpose can be ascertained. Their permanence assumed an inviolate status, and ignoring or circumventing the Sharia became tantamount to belittling the prophetic experience. Sarosh and others would place the system of Shafi'i squarely in the category of acquired religious knowledge, but this system is so fundamental to the subsequent unfolding of Islamic thought and life that it is unlikely to be easily or painlessly superseded. Many writers have held it primarily responsible for the rigidity of the Islamic worldview, but this is entirely false and unjustified. The bridge between the permanent or absolute sacred knowledge and the ephemeral has to be in itself sufficiently immune to tampering. It is not that the system of Shafi'i is sacred in the conventional sense, but it is a good and continuing guide to the knowledge of the sacred within Islam. For over a millennium, this and similar systems which purport to translate the absolute into the relative have proved resilient and flexible and have met the needs of the Muslims and Islamic society. There is little in them which is inherently reactionary or obscurantist. They also have overwhelming support from the mass of Muslims to whom they are addressed in the first place. In Islam, changing the terms of the relationship between God and the human being without preserving the central role of prophecy and the person of the Prophet Muhammad is a futile effort. In the preeminently religious worldview of Islam, a Sharia will always be necessary. The inherent forms of the Sharia may be amenable to change, but the displacement of the Sharia and a disenchanted world of Islam are an altogether different proposition. The future understanding and practice of Islam. An Islamic reformation can also produce totally unpredictable outcomes. The calls for ijtihad or independent reasoning, for example, are based on the assumption that a rational and humanist ethos will govern the reasoning process. But in fact, ijtihad has not so much modernized the faith as led to the questioning of a flexible and accommodating orthodoxy by the radically reactionary ideology of religious fundamentalism. This ideology can drift towards violence and terror at one level, as in fact it has already done. It can also become the handmaiden of powerful princes and dynasties, as the alliance between reactionary Wahhabi clerics and the worldly Saudi royal family amply demonstrates. Both these elements were discernible in the Protestant Reformation, and similar trends are emerging within Islam. The remaking of a civilization will not be simple and short affair. Easy and simplistic predictions which rely on historical analogy or on the inevitable surrender to the forces of technology and economic power are bound to be wrong. The Reformation took nearly 2 centuries before the end of the wars of religion could be proclaimed. The crises within Islam have not yet reached a full-scale war between the sects, although they came dangerously close to that result in recent years in the Arab Middle East, as they did in Iraq during the 2005 to 2007 civil strife, and in Lebanon after the brief war between Israel and Hezbollah in the summer of 2006. The brood danger is dangerously unstable, and it is being added to on an almost daily basis by outside meddling, which is driven by ignorance, sheer bigotry, and unwillingness to accept the worldview, which, no matter how confused, dazed, and tattered at present, might nevertheless offer an alternative vision of life for a significant portion of mankind. The cast of characters and ideas competing for attention and power in the world of Islam is as varied as that of the Reformation of Europe. It is unlikely that one set of ideas or doctrines will prevail or that one state will emerge as the nucleus of a new world power or, in the nightmare of national security policy planners, as a super Islamic state. It is too early to say which way the wind is blowing. There is still a host of issues and problems that have to be resolved, but one can isolate a number of them for special attention. These include the narrowing of Sunni thought, the prospects of Iran's unique form of religious government, and the long term effects of the West's intervention in Muslim affairs, which is partly motivated by the imperative to contain radical political Islam. In this confused and turbulent landscape, the protests for traditional orthodoxies may appear uncertain, but their resilience should not be underestimated. It is likely, therefore, that the varieties of orthodoxies will continue to define the landscape of Islam. What type of orthodoxies will prevail? Will there be space for other forms of Islamic expression, small or large, marginal or significant? At the broadest level, the Sunni world will have to determine for itself whether the historical schools of Islam and their collective traditions continue to form the backbone of jurisprudential rulings during the long process of adjustment which is the revolt of Islam. The challenge from a vigorous and well-funded Wahhabi Salafi movement is far from being contained, but at least the response to its radical violent wing is no longer so supine. Particular schools of Sunni Islam aided by the state may reassert their authority in countries with which they had been historically associated. This seems to be happening in Morocco, where the Maliki school of law is being re-emphasized as state policy, as well as in Malaysia, where the Shafi'i school of law has been intimately connected with the Islamization of the Malays. We may see a greater identification of the varieties of Islam with the major specific ethnic and cultural groups of the historical civilizations of Islam: the Arab world, the South Asian world, the Malay world, the African world, and the Turkic-speaking world. Each of these containing between 200 and 400 million Muslims. A reinvigoration of Sufi orders and of less structured spiritual movements is already apparent, recreating the diversity and the spirit of inner directedness which has been the hallmark of pre-modern Islam. A specific diaspora Islam may also emerge, dealing with the particular needs and requirements of the Muslims, both immigrants and converts, in a Western context. It is in this arena that the more pressing issues of identity, citizenship, and religious loyalty and integration and multiculturalism will have to be resolved or left festering. English has already joined Arabic, Persian, and Urdu, the classical languages of Islamic high culture, as a medium for expression of ideas in modern Islam. Its widespread use by the Western educated Muslim is bound to have an effect on the evolution of Islamic culture and civilization. This is a powerful unknown, as English brings with it the possibility of articulating entirely new concepts. The Shia world, also a bloc of nearly 200 million Muslims, is one that cuts across ethnic and cultural lines. Shiaism will continue to be colored by its status as the national religion of Iran and by the powerful role of Iranian ayatollahs, but it will have to contend with the possibilities of a reinvigorated and independent hierarchy emerging from the upheaval in Iraq, a combination of a territorial Shia hierarchy focused on a particular country but with grand ayatollahs hailing from different parts of the world, a phenomenon which seems to be emerging in Iraq, may coexist with a national Shia authority as in Lebanon. These various outcomes for the Shia would have to deal with the centralized religious authorities of the Iranian state under its supreme religious ruler. The course of the Shiaism in the world will most certainly be affected by the future of the Iranian theocratic regime and to a lesser extent by the revitalization of the seminaries and academics of Najaf. Whether they will ever match the sheer scale and scope of the state sponsored institutions of Iran is a moot point. The challenge of dissident Islamic groups to the ruling orthodoxies will always be there. It may even be exacerbated. The challenges may come from political groups, but they could also be mass movements associated with charismatic leaders or apocalyptic expectations. Mahdist movements, to which the Shia are particularly prone, are already proliferating. They may not overthrow the prevalent orthodoxies, but they will always be an irritant and a refrain. The sum total of these changes, played out over decades, will determine the course of Islam in the 21st century. The Reformation of Islam will be an incremental process of change and adjustment, punctuated by upheavals, crises, and traumas that will feed back into adjustment process. In reality, the issues, although critical to the course of Islam, pale in significance in the face of the main question: will Muslims continue to affirm the power of the unseen as understood in the religion of Islam in the ordering of their private and public lives and in their societies? The Reformation may have well started as a reaction against a worldly church and from the intense desire to find an individual pathway to God. In that sense, the Reformation has a profoundly spiritual aspect, but it could well be argued that the intervening centuries of instability and violence sealed the fate of a public religiosity. Divisions within Christendom became definitive. Kings and emperors grew in influence as the state consolidated its power against ecclesiastical authority, and the personal and spiritual was left behind. The belief, widely held in modern Europe, that religion is inherently divisive is certainly traceable to the travails of the Reformation, but as a way station to secularism and modernity, the Europe wars of religion may have been a necessary precondition. Would Luther have embarked on his epoch-changing calls for reform if he could have foreseen the end of God in the ordering of human affairs? In the final analysis, as Harry Cox wrote in his brilliant 1964 book, The Secular City, the entire thrust of modernity, urbanization, and secularization is to force Christianity into finding a non-religious interpretation of biblical concepts. He goes on to say, it will do no good to cling to our religious and metaphysical versions of Christianity in the hope that one day religion or metaphysics will once again be back. Quoting a prison letter from the German pastor Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who was murdered by the Nazis just before the end of the Second World War, Cox wrote, "We are proceeding towards a time of no religion at all. How do we speak of God without religion?" In another prison letter, Bonhoeffer would write, "The world that has come of age is more godless and perhaps for that very reason nearer to God than the world before its coming of age." If that is the final state of the Protestant Reformation, how can, or more appropriately, how will Muslims ever regard Islam in these or in similar terms? It is very difficult to conceive of the withdrawal of Islam from the public sphere as an essential component of Islam's self-realization. A desacralized world is not fertile ground for the nurturing of a private faith and is far from the reality of Islam, both past and present. The privatization of Islam may be ardent wish of both God-intoxicated individuals and secular modernizers, but it does not appeal to the broad sweep of Muslims who still expect to see a public manifestation of Islam in their daily lives. It is this inherent difficulty in separating the public from the private aspect of Islam and the individual Muslim from Muslim society that makes the task of reforming Islam so fraught with difficulty and unpredictability.